Today, I'm diving deep into a pretty wild question. Does sex actually feel better than just being naturally happy? I'm gonna put it to the test and share my thoughts along the way. When we think about happiness, we often think about the emotional fulfillment we get from doing things we love, being around people we care about, or achieving our goals. On the other hand, sex is often considered the ultimate physical pleasure. But have you ever stopped to think, which one actually feels better? Is it the rush of endorphins we get from a great orgasm, or the sense of satisfaction we get from living a happy, fulfilling life? Measuring pleasure and happiness can be tricky, because they're both subjective experiences. What makes one person happy might not be the same for someone else. And when it comes to sex, it's hard to quantify the pleasure we get from it. But that's exactly what we're going to try to do today. One way to approach this is to think about the different scales we use to measure happiness and pleasure. For happiness, we might use something like the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire, which asks questions about how satisfied we are with our lives, how often we experience positive emotions, and how much we feel like we're living our best lives. But when it comes to sex, how do we even begin to measure the pleasure we get from it? Do we use brain scans to track dopamine release? Do we ask people to rate their orgasms on a scale of 1 to 10? Another thing to consider is that pleasure and happiness can manifest in different ways. For some people, sex might be the ultimate expression of love and connection, and the pleasure they get from it is deeply tied to the emotional fulfillment they feel. For others, sex might be more about physical release, and the pleasure they get from it is more about satisfying a biological urge. So, when we're trying to compare the pleasure of sex to the happiness we get from other sources, we have to take into account the different ways that pleasure and happiness can manifest. We'll dive deeper into the psychological and biological perspectives on this question as we go on, but for now, let's just acknowledge that this is a complex and multifaceted issue. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and we're going to have to explore this question from a lot of different angles. When we look at the psychological and biological perspectives on sex and happiness, things get really interesting. From a biological standpoint, sex releases a ton of hormones like oxytocin and dopamine, which are associated with pleasure and bonding. These hormones can create a feeling of intense connection and attachment, which can be really powerful. But when we look at happiness, we see that it's often associated with similar hormones, like endorphins and serotonin. So, is the pleasure we get from sex really that different from the happiness we get from other sources? One thing that's really interesting is that research has shown that the brain processes pleasure and happiness in similar ways, whether it's from sex or from other sources. This means that, from a biological standpoint, the pleasure we get from sex might not be fundamentally different from the happiness we get from other sources. But what does that mean for our question, does sex feel better than natural happiness? When we dive deeper into the research, we start to see that the relationship between sex and happiness is really nuanced. For example, one study found that people who have more frequent sex tend to be happier overall, but another study found that the relationship between sex and happiness is more complicated than that. It turns out that sex can actually increase feelings of anxiety and stress in some people, which can negate any potential happiness benefits. So, what's the main insight here? It seems that sex and happiness are closely linked, but not in a straightforward way. Sex can be a source of great pleasure and happiness, but it's not always a guarantee. And natural happiness, on the other hand, can be a more reliable source of fulfillment, but it might not be as intense as the pleasure we get from sex. In the end, it seems that the relationship between sex and happiness is really complex, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer to our question. But what we can say is that both sex and happiness are important for our overall well-being, and that they can complement each other in really powerful ways. Thanks for watching, and if you have thoughts on this question, be sure to share them in the comments below.